I came back home after 13 months thinking the hardest part was behind me. Turns out I hadn't even seen the real problem yet. From the road, something fell off before I even parked, like when you walk into your house and a chair is just slightly out of place. Except this wasn't a chair. This was an entire hillside. And the worst part is, I already knew who did it before I even stepped out of the truck. I bought that piece of land back in late 2020, just outside a small mountain town in Tennessee. Quiet area, nothing fancy, just trees, slope, and enough space that you didn't have to hear your neighbor sneeze. I wasn't trying to build some big dream house overnight. I just wanted something steady, something I could work on between deployments. The lot had a steep grade on one side, and I knew from day one it was going to take time. Drainage first, then retaining walls, then maybe eventually a small cabin. Slow progress didn't bother me. I was used to that kind of pace. Now the guy next door, his name was Rick Dalton, early 50s, built like someone who used to do real labor, but now mostly pointed at things and told other people what to do. He had that contractor energy, always half in work mode, half in I know better than you mode. At first, we were fine. Not friends, but the kind of neighbors who nod, maybe exchange a few words about the weather, nothing more. But Rick had a problem, his driveway. It ended at this awkward angle right before the slope dropped off, and every time he tried to get his boat trailer in or out, it turned into a whole production. I mean, I'd watched him do it a couple times before I left. Back up, pull forward, straighten, stop, get out, look, shake his head, try again. Took him like 5 minutes just to line it up. You could tell it bothered him. Not in a casual way either, more like the kind of thing that eats at a guy's pride. And then there was my land, specifically that hillside on my side of the property line. If that slope was cut just right, leveled out a bit, it would have created the perfect access path straight into his driveway. I remember the first time he mentioned it. We were both outside, just standing near the fence line. He said, "You ever thought about grading that side? Could make it more usable." I shrugged, told him, "Yeah." Eventually, got plans drawn up, just taking it slow. He nodded, but there was this look, like he wasn't really hearing me, more like he was calculating something. Before I deployed, I went through my usual routine. Locked the gate, checked the boundaries, took photos from every angle. I always do that. When you're gone that long, you learn not to leave things to chance. I remember standing there that last evening, looking at the hillside, thinking about where the retaining wall would go, how the drainage would run. It was all still in my head, still mine. And then I left. 13 months later, I come back, driving up that same road, same trees, same turn. But the second I saw the left side of the property, my stomach dropped. The tree line wasn't right. There was a break in it, like someone had taken a bite out of the hill. I slowed down, leaned forward over the steering wheel, trying to make sense of it, and then it hit me. There was a cut. Not a small one either, a full, deliberate excavation carved straight into my hillside. I parked without even turning the engine off all the way, just stepped out and walked toward it, and the closer I got, the worse it looked. About 40 feet across, maybe 12 feet wide, and dug deep enough that you could see where the soil layers had been exposed. And it wasn't just dirt, it was packed with gravel, clean, compacted, like a proper access road. His access road. I didn't need to guess. Tire tracks were already pressed into the gravel, curved in a way that led directly down into his driveway. His boat trailer tracks. I recognized the pattern from before. He hadn't just cut into my land, he'd been using it. I stood there for a while, not saying anything, just looking at it, trying to process how someone crosses that line so casually. It wasn't like moving a fence post a few inches. This was heavy equipment, multiple days of work, deliveries, planning. This wasn't an accident. This was a decision. And the thing is, I wasn't even angry at first. Not the kind of loud, explosive anger people expect. It was quieter than that. Colder. The kind that settles in your chest and just sits there while you start thinking 3 steps ahead. I walked back toward the house, pulled out my phone, and scrolled through the photos I'd taken before deployment. Same angle, same slope, untouched, natural, exactly how I left it. Then I looked back up at what it had become. That's when it shifted. Because this wasn't just about a neighbor being disrespectful. This was going to cost money. A lot of money. That hillside wasn't just dirt. It was part of a drainage system I'd been building out slowly, carefully. You cut into that the wrong way. You don't just change the shape. You change how water moves, how soil holds, how everything behaves over time. And Rick, he either didn't know that or didn't care. I remember muttering to myself, all right, we're not doing this the easy way. I didn't go knock on his door, didn't call him, didn't give him a chance to explain it away or pretend it was some misunderstanding. Because there was no version of this that was a misunderstanding. Instead, I sat down at my kitchen table, still dusty from being empty so long, and made one phone call. My attorney picked up on the second ring, and that's where things started to get expensive, just not for me. My attorney, Daniel Reeves, is not the kind of guy you call unless you're ready to follow through. Calm voice, doesn't waste words, and most importantly, he doesn't react, he calculates. I explained what I saw, kept it simple, no exaggeration, just facts, excavation, gravel, clear use, and the timeline. There was a short pause on the line, not confusion, more like confirmation. He said, don't touch anything. Don't confront him. Document everything again, and I'll start making calls. That was it. No drama, no speculation, just direction. So I went back out there with my phone, took new photos from the same angles as before, walked the entire cut, measured rough dimensions with my steps, recorded video, even zoomed in on the tire tracks. The more I looked, the more details started showing themselves, edges too clean to be rushed, gravel spread evenly, compacted in layers. This wasn't some weekend shortcut. This was planned, executed, and finished like a job, which meant there would be a trail. Over the next few days, things moved faster than I expected. Daniel brought in a geotechnical engineer, a guy named Foster, mid-60s, quiet, wore the kind of boots that had seen more land than people. He walked the hillside slowly, stopping every few feet, digging his heel into the soil, crouching down, running his fingers through the exposed layers like he was reading something written there. At one point he looked up at me and said, "Whoever did this didn't just cut your hill. They compromised it." That word stuck with me, compromised. He explained it in a way that made it worse the more I understood it. The cut had interrupted the natural drainage paths I had been managing for 2 years. Water that used to disperse gradually would now concentrate along that artificial channel. The gravel didn't fix that, it masked it. Underneath, the soil structure was destabilized. Over time, especially with heavy rain, it could lead to erosion, shifting, even partial collapse if left untreated. This wasn't cosmetic damage. This was structural. A couple days later, the report came in. Clean, detailed, impossible to argue with. Remediation alone, $34,000. That covered removing the gravel, regrading the slope, restoring soil integrity, reseeding, and stabilizing the entire section properly. And that was just to bring it back to where it had been. Then came the arborist. 3 mature hardwood trees had been cleared to make space for the cut. Not saplings, not brush, trees that had been there longer than I had. The valuation came back at $8,400. I remember sitting there with both reports spread out on the table, just staring at the numbers, not shocked anymore, just focused. Because now this wasn't about what happened, it was about what it costs. And that's when Daniel made the next move. He contacted county code enforcement. Now, I didn't fully understand how serious that step was until the inspector showed up. His name was Harris, older guy, sun-worn face, the kind of expression that doesn't change much unless something really gets his attention. He walked the site, same as Foster did, but faster, more direct, like he'd seen enough to recognize patterns. About halfway through, he stopped, looked at the cut, then looked at me and said, "I've been doing this 11 years. I haven't seen an unauthorized disturbance this size in a long time." Not said loudly, just matter of fact. Then he started explaining what Rick had actually triggered without realizing it. Or maybe without caring. In that state, any disturbance over a certain threshold requires an erosion and sediment control permit. That's not optional. That's baseline regulation. And this was way past that threshold. No permit had been filed, which meant every single day since the excavation counted as a violation. 13 months. Daily fines. I didn't even need to ask how that adds up. I could see it in the way Harris wrote his notes. Steady, precise, no hesitation. Within the same week, an official violation notice was issued through the state's Department of Environmental and Land Resources. It outlined everything: unauthorized excavation, environmental impact, failure to obtain permits, ongoing noncompliance. That's when Rick finally reached out. Not to me, to Daniel. Funny how that works. 3 days after the notice, Daniel calls me and says he wants to talk. I asked about fixing it. Daniel paused, then said, about minimizing what this turns into. That told me everything I needed to know. We didn't rush into anything. Instead, we started pulling records. Subpoenaed equipment rental logs, material delivery invoices, anything tied to the time frame I was deployed. And just like Foster predicted, there was a trail. The excavator had been rented 8 months into my deployment. For consecutive days. The rental agreement had Rick's name, his business, his signature. Then the gravel, delivered in multiple loads. And here's the part that almost made me laugh when I saw it. Delivery address my property. Not his. Mine. You could line it all up. Dates, equipment, materials, usage. It wasn't circumstantial. It was documented, signed, and timestamped. When Daniel sent over the compiled evidence to Rick's attorney, the tone shifted immediately. No more misunderstanding. No more soft language. Now it was numbers, liability, exposure. That's when I finally saw Rick again. He didn't come over to apologize, of course not. That's not who he was. Instead, he stood at the edge of his deck while we were out there reviewing the site again. Arms crossed, watching, not saying a word. So I walked over. Not aggressively, just enough to be heard. I said, "You cut 40 feet into my land." He didn't respond right away. Just looked past me at the hill, like maybe if he didn't make eye contact, it wasn't real. Then he shrugged slightly and said, "It cleaned it up." Cleaned it up. I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it confirmed exactly what I thought. In his mind, this wasn't theft, it was improvement. He saw a problem, and he solved it, just didn't bother with ownership, permission, or consequences. I nodded, took a step back, and said, "Yeah, we're going to clean it up." And then I walked away, because at that point, there was nothing left to argue about. This wasn't going to be settled with words. It was going to be settled with invoices. Once everything was on paper, it stopped being emotional, it turned into math. And math doesn't argue, it just adds up. Rick's attorney reached out again, this time a lot more direct, a lot less confident. They weren't denying anything anymore. Couldn't, not with the rental records, the delivery invoices, the inspection report, all stacked neatly in a file that basically told the entire story without anyone needing to raise their voice. The conversation had shifted from what happened to how bad is this going to get. Daniel laid it out clean. Remediation, $34,000. Timber loss, $8,400. State fines, already accumulating, sitting at just over $6,000 and climbing. Then add legal fees, engineering reports, site inspections, everything tied to undoing what had been done. Total exposure, a little over $60,000. I remember asking Daniel, "Is that everything?" He said, "That's everything we can quantify. The rest would be if we decide to push further." And that was the part that lingered in my head, push further. Because technically we could have unauthorized excavation at that scale, environmental violations, property damage. There were grounds to escalate. Even push toward criminal charges depending on how aggressive we wanted to be. It wasn't off the table. But here's the thing. I wasn't interested in dragging this out for another year just to make a point. I wanted my land back the way it was, and I wanted him to feel exactly what that decision cost him. No more, no less. So we made it simple. Pay everything, or we go all the way. There wasn't much back and forth after that. Rick paid. All of it. The checks came through in stages, but they came through. No delays, no excuses, just quiet compliance. And honestly, that might have been the most surprising part of the whole thing. A guy like him. I expected resistance, deflection, something. But once the numbers were real, once the risk was clear, he folded. And then the crews showed up. Day one, early morning, trucks, equipment, a full team. They didn't ease into it either. First thing they did was start pulling out the gravel, layer by layer, loading it up, hauling it off. What had taken Rick 4 days to build started disappearing within hours. I stood there for a while watching it, coffee in hand, just taking it in. Not in a triumphant way, more like closing a chapter. Every scoop of gravel that came out felt like the land was exhaling, like it was finally being allowed to reset. The process took 18 days. 18 days of reshaping, stabilizing, rebuilding what had been there before someone decided it was theirs to change. The engineers came back out midway through, checked compaction, slope angles, water flow paths. everything was done by the book this time. No shortcuts, no assumptions. And Rick, he watched all of it. Every single day, from his back deck. Same spot, same posture, arms crossed, leaning slightly forward, like he was trying to understand how something that seemed so simple turned into something this final. We never spoke during those 18 days. Not once. There was nothing left to say. By the end of it, the hillside looked like it used to. Maybe even better, honestly. The grading was precise, the soil stabilized, fresh seed laid down evenly across the surface. If you didn't know what had happened, you'd never guess there had been a road carved through it just weeks before. The geotechnical engineer signed off on it. Full restoration. No remaining risk. Clean. And just like that, it was over. Or at least my side of it was. Because Rick still had his driveway. Same awkward angle. Same tight space. Same problem he started with. A couple weeks after everything wrapped up, I happened to be outside when he was trying to back his boat trailer in again. I didn't plan it, didn't go out there to watch, just happened to be there. And sure enough, same routine. Back up, stop, pull forward, adjust, get out, look, shake his head. Again. And I'll be honest, I didn't feel satisfaction the way people think you would in a situation like that. It wasn't, you got what you deserved. It was quieter. More like, that's the reality of it. He wanted an easier way. He found one. And it cost him $63,000 just to end up exactly where he started. We never had a conversation after that. Not a real one. Just the occasional nod if we happened to cross paths. The kind you give a stranger, not a neighbor. Whatever version of neighborly existed before, that was gone. And maybe that's the part people don't think about when they hear stories like this. It's not just about the money. It's about what it changes. You stop assuming people will respect boundaries just because they exist. You stop thinking silence means understanding. Sometimes silence just means someone is waiting for an opportunity. If I had gone over there that first day, knocked on his door, tried to talk it out, maybe it would have played out differently. Maybe he would have apologized. Maybe he would have offered to fix it. Or maybe he would have minimized it, delayed it, turned it into something that dragged on for months with no real resolution. I don't know. What I do know is this. The moment he decided to bring in an excavator and cut into land that wasn't his, he made it a legal problem. And once it's a legal problem, you solve it with structure, not emotion. Still, I think about it sometimes. Not the damage, not the money, but that decision point. The moment he stood there, probably looking at that same hillside, thinking, no one's here. I can just do this. That's the part that sticks. So now I'm curious. If you were in my position, would you have pushed it further? Taken it into criminal territory, made it even heavier than it already was? Or would you have stopped exactly where I did? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I've heard both sides of this, and honestly, I still don't think there's a clean answer. And if you've ever dealt with a neighbor who crossed a line like this, you already know, it's never just about the land. If you're watching this, there's a good chance you've already crossed paths with that person, the neighbor who thinks rules are optional when they're inconvenient. The kind who treats shared space like a suggestion and private property like a personal inconvenience. We've all got one story like that, at least. But I'm willing to bet my late grandfather's rusted-out tractor that you don't have this story. Because my problem wasn't just an annoying neighbor. It wasn't even just a power-hungry homeowners association. It was a woman who decided, without asking, without permission, without even a shred of shame, that my land, my family's land, was now her personal shortcut to save exactly 3 minutes on her morning commute. And those 3 minutes were about to cost her tens of thousands of dollars, her pride, and a very expensive lesson in physics, soil mechanics, and rural property law. Let's call her Marjorie Kellerman. Marjorie lived in a brand new development that popped up practically overnight on the western edge of my ranch. One of those glossy, copy-paste executive neighborhoods where the houses are massive, the yards are microscopic, and the HOA rules are thicker than the Bible, but somehow only apply to other people. My place, Red Willow Ranch, is the opposite of that world. 300 and change acres of rolling pasture, old oak stands that predate electricity, cattle that know my voice better than most people do, land that's been worked, sweated on, bled on, and handed down for 4 generations. This isn't an investment property. To me, it's not a line on a spreadsheet. It's where my mornings start before sunrise and end after the cicadas take over. It's quiet, it's earned, and it's sacred. At least, it was until Marjorie discovered my dirt access track. Now, I need to be clear about this track, because that's where the whole illusion starts. It wasn't a road. It wasn't paved. It didn't have signs or curbs or lanes. It was two parallel ruts in the dirt, tractor width, used for hauling hay, checking fence lines, and getting equipment from the north pasture to the barn. It cut across my land and eventually dumped out onto a county road on the far side. If you didn't own the land, didn't care about suspensions, and didn't respect boundaries, sure, it shaved a few minutes off a drive into town. That's where Marjorie came in. The first time I saw her, I was repairing a stretch of barbed wire a good quarter-mile inside my property line when I heard this low, aggressive engine hum behind me. Not a tractor, not a truck, something expensive. I turned around and there it was, a pearl-white luxury SUV easing off the pristine HOA cul-de-sac and rolling straight onto my dirt track like it had every right in the world to be there. She stopped next to me, window gliding down with that soft electric whir, oversized sunglasses, manicured nails gripping the wheel, jaw already set like she'd practiced being annoyed in the mirror. "Excuse me," she said, not asking, not friendly, just issuing a demand. "Does this road go through?" I wiped the sweat off my forehead with my glove and said, as calmly as I could, "No, ma'am. This is private property. You'll want to turn back and take the main road, about 2 miles east." She let out this little huff, the kind that says you've inconvenienced me by existing. "Well, my GPS says it connects." "Your GPS is wrong," I said, still calm, "and you're trespassing." And that's when I realized who I was dealing with. She didn't argue. She didn't ask follow-up questions. She didn't apologize. She rolled the window back up, stared straight ahead, and punched the gas, bouncing past me, dust flying, like my words were background noise from someone beneath her. I stood there, fence pliers in hand, watching her taillights disappear over the rise, thinking, that was rude, but surely that's a one-time thing. It wasn't. That drive was a test run. Within a week, I saw that same SUV cutting across my land almost daily, morning like clockwork, sometimes in the afternoon, once even near dusk. She wasn't lost anymore. She'd adopted the route. She was treating my ranch like a toll-free express lane. So I tried the neighborly route first, because that's what normal people do. I put up a large metal sign right where she hopped the curb from the HOA development, reflective red letters, bolted in deep, private property, and no trespassing, and underneath it, a smaller sign, polite but clear, active agriculture, heavy equipment. I figured signage, done, problem solved. That sign lasted exactly 2 days. On the third afternoon, it was gone. Not knocked over, not damaged, gone. I found it half a mile away in a drainage ditch, bent, scratched, tire tracks stamped right through the middle like a signature. The tread pattern matched her SUV perfectly. That's when irritation turned into something colder. I decided to catch her face to face. I parked my old farm truck near the entrance one morning and waited, and right on schedule, 8:12 a.m., there she came, rolling off the curb like she owned the place. I stepped out and stood dead center in the track. She stopped, mostly because she had no other option. I walked up and said, "Ma'am, we need to talk. You cannot keep driving through here. This is private land. It's dangerous. You're damaging my soil, and it puts my livestock at risk." She cracked the window maybe 2 inches. "I've been using this road for weeks," she snapped. "It's clearly an established right-of-way." I felt my jaw tighten. "It's a farm track," I said. "My family's been using it for 70 years. Your weeks of trespassing don't create rights." She adjusted her sunglasses and said the words that changed everything. "Well, the HOA president said it looked like an old access road we could probably use. It's much more convenient for several of us." That's when I realized this wasn't just entitlement, it was organization. I told her flat out, "The HOA doesn't own this land, and they can't grant access. The next time I see you here, I'm calling the sheriff." She smirked. "This is a community issue," she said. "You're being very unreasonable, hoarding all this land." Then she swerved around my truck, drove straight through a patch of young winter grass, and sped off. Hoarding land. That night, I called the HOA president. His response was dismissive, casual, like I was bothering him over something trivial. "If the road is already there," he said, "what's the harm in a few cars using it?" That was the moment I understood something important. To them, I wasn't a landowner protecting a livelihood. I was an obstacle, and obstacles, in their world, get pushed aside. All right, pause the story for a second, because what's happening here isn't just one rude woman cutting across a field. This is actually a very common HOA power dynamic. And once you understand it, Marjorie's behavior stops looking random and starts looking textbook. According to standard procedure in most homeowners associations, an HOA has authority only over common areas it owns or maintains, roads, sidewalks, shared green spaces, things like that. What it absolutely does not have the power to do is grant access across land it doesn't own, especially privately deeded agricultural land. That's not community governance. That's trespass dressed up in a blazer. From a legal perspective, Marjorie's favorite phrase, established right-of-way, is meaningless here. An easement doesn't appear just because someone drives somewhere a few times. It requires written agreements, recorded deeds, or decades of uninterrupted, uncontested use. Weeks of shortcutting doesn't create rights. It creates liability. Now, psychologically, this is where it gets interesting. This is a psychological trap called moral licensing. Marjorie wasn't thinking, I'm trespassing. She was thinking the HOA said it's probably fine, which gave her permission in her own mind to ignore direct warnings, signage, and even law enforcement. Once authority, real or imagined, backs entitlement, people stop negotiating and start conquering. And that's why polite conversations stopped working. Because in her head, the rules had already been rewritten. When polite conversations fail, when signs get ripped out of the ground, when the law shrugs and says civil matter, something shifts inside you. Not rage exactly. Not yet. More like clarity. I stood there one evening watching fresh tire ruts scar my pasture. Mud churned where grass used to grow, and I realized something simple and terrifying at the same time. Marjorie wasn't going to stop because she didn't think she had to. In her mind, the HOA had crowned her right, and anyone who stood in her way was just noise. And noise can be ignored. So I stopped trying to convince her. Instead, I started preparing. First stop was Earl Patterson, an old friend of my dad's, retired land surveyor, the kind of man who knows property law the way other people know football stats. I laid the whole thing out over bad coffee in his shop, every incursion, every conversation, every threat. Earl didn't interrupt, just nodded slowly, then said, Son, your boundaries are clean. No easement, no access, no ambiguity. She's bluffing because no one's called it yet. He rolled out a plat map and tapped the line with a calloused finger. First thing we do, he said, is make sure no one can pretend they didn't know where your land starts. That weekend, we walked the entire boundary, drove steel posts deep into the ground, bright orange caps, reflective markers, signage bolted on with lock nuts, the kind you don't remove unless you brought tools and bad intentions. As we worked, Marjorie drove by again, slow this time, staring, taking inventory. Earl squinted and smiled. That thing's got low clearance, doesn't it? Yeah, I said, built for asphalt. He chuckled. Be a shame if this track needed maintenance. But I didn't move yet. I needed certainty. So I drove into town and sat down with Rachel Monroe, a property rights attorney who'd made a career out of defending farmers from developers with bigger wallets and smaller patience. I told her exactly what I wanted to know. What can I legally do to my own land that discourages trespass without turning into a lawsuit? She laughed. Then she got serious. From a legal perspective, she said, a landowner has broad authority to modify terrain for legitimate agricultural purposes, tilling, grading, erosion control, drainage management, even placing rocks or barriers, as long as you're not creating a concealed mantrap. No spikes, no hidden pits, no intentional deception. But, she said, raising a finger, you must warn. Clear signage. Multiple points. No ambiguity. If someone ignores warnings and damages their vehicle, that responsibility shifts to them. Document everything. I walked out of her office with a plan and a quiet sense of inevitability. If Marjorie wanted to treat my ranch like a road, I was going to remind her exactly what working land feels like. I started with the signs, big ones. Not just no trespassing, but specific warnings. Hazardous terrain ahead. Agricultural operations in progress. Not a through road. Risk of vehicle damage. One at the entrance. 120 feet in. One more just to be sure. You'd have to be blind or determined to miss them. Then came the land itself. I hitched up my heaviest disc harrow, Not a garden toy, a serious piece of equipment meant to break hard clay, and dropped the discs deep. Real deep. I drove perpendicular to the direction of travel, churning the soil into aggressive corrugations, soft ridges, loose earth that shifted under weight. For my tractor, it was nothing. For a luxury SUV, it was going to feel like riding a jackhammer made of mud. Next came the rocks. I hauled in jagged stones from the creek bed, melon-sized, heavy, half buried along the center hump and edges. Visible, obvious, impossible to ignore unless you were convinced you shouldn't have to. Then the low spot. There was already a natural depression that collected water. I deepened it slightly, diverted overflow from a cattle trough, just enough to turn it into a mud bog. Innocent looking on the surface, but thick, sucking clay underneath. And finally, the piece de resistance. Manure. Every ranch has it. Compost, old hay, waste, rich, dark, pungent. I spread a thick layer across a stretch right after the mud bog. Not hidden, not disguised, just waiting. I photographed everything. Timestamps, angles, signs, terrain. When I finished, the track looked exactly like what it was, a working farm lane under heavy maintenance. And then I waited. 2 days passed. Nothing. For a moment, I thought maybe she'd finally understood. Thursday morning proved me wrong. At 8:28 a.m., I heard it, the engine revving harder than necessary, that familiar sound of confidence and impatience. I grabbed my coffee and binoculars and stepped onto the porch. There she was. Marjorie slowed at the entrance. She saw the signs. She saw the churned earth. She hesitated, and then she accelerated. She hit the furrows too fast. The SUV bucked violently, suspension screaming, her head snapping side to side inside the cabin. I could almost feel her anger turning into concentration as she tried to drive through it. She reached the rock section and swerved. Too late. Metal scraped stone. A sharp, unmistakable sound drifted across the pasture. She didn't stop. Then came the mud. She probably thought it was just a puddle. Gunned the engine. The front wheels dropped like they'd fallen off the edge of the world. The rear tires spun, flinging mud everywhere, coating that pearl-white paint in brown sludge. The vehicle sank. Axle deep. Then deeper. Silence. The driver's door flew open. She stepped out, straight into mud, looked down, and screamed. A sound so raw and furious I heard it from hundreds of yards away. She tried rocking the car. Nothing. She was trapped. And the only way back was on foot. I waited a minute. Then I drove down the field line and stopped a safe distance away. Having some trouble? I called out. She turned on me like a cornered animal. You did this, she shrieked. You sabotaged this road. I put on my best confused face. Road? I said. Ma'am, this is my pasture. I've been doing agricultural maintenance. Didn't you see the signs? This is a trap, she yelled. The rocks are erosion control, I said calmly. The tilling's for soil health. The mud's drainage. If you'd stayed on the paved road like I asked weeks ago, you wouldn't be sinking into a cow field. I'm calling the sheriff. Please do, I said. You might also want a tow truck. Bring a long winch. When the deputy arrived, same one from before, he took one look at the signs, the terrain, the buried SUV, and sighed. Ma'am, he said, you're trespassing on clearly marked private land. The owner has the right to manage his soil. You ignored warnings. The tow truck driver charged her a hazardous recovery fee. It took an hour to get the SUV out. The exhaust tore loose on the rocks. I didn't smile. I didn't have to. The thing about moments like that is, you think the story ends when the tow truck leaves, when the dust settles, when the problem finally drives away on a flatbed. It doesn't. The real ending happens quietly, afterward, in paperwork, in silence, in the way power shifts when someone realizes they were never as untouchable as they thought. A week after the incident, I got a letter from the HOA's attorney. Formal letterhead. Very serious tone. They demanded compensation for vehicle damage, emotional distress, and unreasonable land alteration. I handed it straight to Rachel. She responded with a packet. Photos of every sign. Time-stamped images of the terrain. Video from a trail camera showing Marjorie driving past multiple warnings without stopping. And a counterclaim for soil damage, crop loss, and remediation costs. That letter changed the temperature fast. Because suddenly the HOA president, who had waved me off before, realized this wasn't a neighborly dispute anymore. It was a liability nightmare. He showed up in person. walked the boundary, saw the signs, saw the land. 2 days later, a memo went out to every resident. The western track is private property. Do not use it. The HOA assumes no liability for damages incurred by trespassing. Marjorie tried small claims court anyway. The judge looked at the evidence for less than 10 minutes. Then he looked at her and said, "Ma'am, if you drive into a clearly marked hazardous area, you don't get to sue the ground for being there." Case dismissed. With prejudice. She still lives next door. She drives the long way now. And the track? It's gone. Grass reclaimed it. Blackberry bushes grew in thick and thorny along the edge. The land healed, like it always does when you give it space. Now, here's the part people usually miss. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about winning. It was about boundaries. From a legal perspective, this situation only worked out because everything was documented, warned, and justified. That's the part nobody likes to hear. There's no shortcut around doing things the right way if you want protection when things go wrong. And from a psychological standpoint, this whole saga is a lesson in how entitlement grows. It feeds on silence. It feeds on hesitation. It feeds on people being too polite to enforce lines that were never meant to be crossed. This is a psychological trap a lot of people fall into. The belief that if you explain yourself clearly enough, the other person will eventually respect you. But when someone believes convenience outranks consent, explanation sounds like weakness. The lesson here is simple, but it's not easy. Respect doesn't always come from asking nicely. Sometimes it comes from designing systems, legal, physical, social, that make disrespect inconvenient. That doesn't mean cruelty. It doesn't mean escalation for sport. It means knowing your rights, understanding human behavior, and refusing to let someone else's urgency become your emergency. If you're dealing with an HOA, a neighbor, a workplace, even family dynamics where lines keep getting crossed, ask yourself this. Have you clearly marked your boundaries, or are you hoping someone else will honor them for you? Because hoping is cheap. Engineering respect takes effort. So I'm curious, what would you have done? Would you have let it slide to keep the peace? Would you have gone straight to court? Or would you have done exactly what I did? Used the system, the land, and the rules as they were written? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them. And if you've got your own story about entitlement meeting reality, I promise you're not alone. Just remember, keep your gates locked, know where your lines are, and never underestimate the power of a well-placed mud hole.